The thundering hooves of a roan stallion kicked up dust across the harsh Arizona landscape as Mathew Hartridge raced toward home, the news of his son's accident weighing heavy on his mind. The year was 1879, and life in the small town of Seligman was as unforgiving as the desert that surrounded it. Matthew's mind churned with worry. His foreman had ridden out to the north pasture just an hour ago, interrupting the cattle drive preparations to tell him that 5-year-old Samuel had fallen from the porch steps and broken his arm. It wasn't the broken bone that troubled Matthew. Most children were resilient, after all, but rather what Samuel had been clutching when he fell. The hand-carved wooden horse that had belonged to Matthew's father and his father before him. The toy, his son's most treasured possession, had shattered on the hard, packed earth. As the town came into view, Matthew's thoughts drifted to his wife, Elizabeth, who had passed 2 winters ago during a fever that had swept through Seligman. Since then, he'd been both mother and father to Samuel, a role that left him feeling perpetually inadequate despite his best efforts. The main street was quiet in the late afternoon sun. Matthew nodded briefly to Sheriff Cooper, who stood outside the jailhouse smoking a cigar, then passed the general store where he noticed a wagon he didn't recognize. New folks in town were rare enough to be noteworthy, but his concern for Samuel pushed the observation aside. He reached his modest ranch house on the outskirts of town and dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, tying the reins hastily to the hitching post. The front door swung open before he reached it. "Papa," Samuel called out, his small face streaked with dried tears, his right arm bound in a cloth sling. The boy attempted to run to him but was gently held back by a woman Matthew had never seen before. "Careful now, little one," she said in a soft voice that carried the hint of an Eastern accent. "Your arm needs rest." Matthew stepped inside, removing his hat. "Samuel," he said, kneeling to embrace his son with care. "What happened, son?" Samuel's bottom lip trembled. "I was playing soldiers on the porch steps and I slipped. Grandpa's horse broke, Papa, I broke it." Fresh tears welled in the boy's eyes. "Hush now," Matthew soothed, running a calloused hand through his son's sandy hair. "It was an accident." He looked up at the woman who stood watching them. She was tall and slender, with chestnut hair pulled back into a sensible bun. Her dress was plain but well made, the dark blue fabric setting off eyes the color of a summer sky. She wasn't conventionally beautiful, but there was something about her steady gaze that caught and held his attention. "Willa Easton," she said, extending her hand in a surprisingly forthright manner. "I arrived in town today. I was at the general store when your son was brought in by your housekeeper." Matthew stood, taking her hand briefly. "Mathew Hartridge, I'm obliged to you for your help, Miss Easton, Mrs. Cleary went to fetch the doctor," Willa explained, "but he's out at the Murphy place delivering a baby. I have some experience with setting bones, so I helped as best I could." Matthew noticed the neatness of the sling and the calm competence in her manner. "You did a fine job from the looks of it." "The break is clean," she said. "With proper rest, it should heal well." She moved toward the table where a cloth bundle lay. "Mrs. Cleary has gone to her sister's for the night, something about a sick niece. I was just preparing to leave when I heard your arrival." Samuel tugged at his father's pant leg with his good hand. "My horse broke into pieces, Papa. The head came right off." Matthew crouched again to his son's level. "Where are the pieces, Sam?" The boy pointed to a small box on the mantel. Matthew retrieved it and opened the lid to find the splintered remains of the wooden horse. The craftsmanship was evident even in its broken state: the flowing mane, the proud arch of the neck, the delicate carving of the legs. His heart sank. 3 generations of Hartridge boys had treasured this toy, and now it was beyond repair. "I'm sorry," Willa said, watching his face. "Your son said it was very special." Mathew closed the box and set it aside. "It was my father's and his father's before him. Just a toy, but—" He trailed off, not wanting to upset Samuel further. "Papa makes the best horses in all of Arizona Territory," Samuel declared proudly, momentarily forgetting his grief. "He can fix anything." Mathew smiled sadly. "Not this time, son. I'm afraid woodcarving isn't among my talents." He ruffled Samuel's hair again. "But it's just a thing. You're what matters, and you're going to be right as rain before you know it." Samuel's face fell. "But who will protect me from the monsters under the bed? Thunder Horse kept them away." Willa knelt beside Samuel, her skirts pooling around her on the rough wooden floor. "Thunder Horse, that's a fine name for a brave steed." Samuel nodded solemnly. "He was the fastest horse in the whole territory. Papa said so." "I believe it," Willa said, her voice serious. She glanced up at Mathew. "Mr. Hartridge, I should be going. I've taken a room at Mrs. Holloway's boarding house. I'll check on Samuel's arm tomorrow if that's acceptable." Mathew was struck by a sudden reluctance to see her leave. It had been a long time since anyone but Mrs. Cleary had occupied this house with him and Samuel, and Willa Easton brought a certain calm presence that he found unexpectedly welcome. "You're welcome to stay for supper," he found himself saying. "It's the least I can offer for your help today." Willa hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you. I'd be glad to." As Mathew moved to the kitchen to prepare a simple meal, he asked over his shoulder, "What brings you to Seligman, Mrs. Easton? We don't get many new faces." There was a slight pause before she answered. "I'm a widow, Mr. Hartridge. My husband died last year in Chicago. I'm a teacher by training, and I saw the advertisement for a schoolmistress here." Mathew glanced at her with new interest. The town had been trying to establish a proper school for months. "The position's still open, as far as I know. The town council meets tomorrow evening. Mayor Wilson would be the one to speak with." "I plan to," she said, helping Samuel settle at the table. "I've taught for 6 years in Chicago. A change seemed necessary." There was a story there, Mathew thought, but he wouldn't pry. Everyone who came west did so for their own reasons, often leaving something behind. They ate a simple supper of beans, cornbread, and coffee, with milk for Samuel. The conversation flowed more easily than Mathew would have expected, with Samuel chattering about his adventures on the ranch and Willa asking intelligent questions about the town and its needs. As twilight deepened outside the windows, Samuel began to droop, the excitement and pain of the day catching up to him. "Time for bed, son," Mathew said, rising from the table. Samuel's eyes widened with sudden alarm. "But Papa, Thunder Horse is broken. Who will keep the monsters away?" Mathew saw the genuine fear in his son's eyes and felt a familiar helplessness. He wished, not for the first time, that Elizabeth were here. She would have known exactly what to say. To his surprise, Willa spoke up. "Samuel, would you allow me to stand guard tonight? I'm very good at spotting monsters." Samuel considered this with serious deliberation. "Do you know what they look like?" "Oh yes," Willa said confidently. "They're about this big," she held her hands a foot apart, "with green scales and purple spots. They hate the sound of singing and run away from brave little boys." Samuel looked impressed. "That's exactly right. How did you know?" Willa winked at him. "I've had plenty of experience with monsters." "Will you really stay?" Samuel asked, hope lighting his features. Willa glanced at Mathew, a question in her eyes. He found himself nodding before he'd fully considered the impropriety of having a strange woman spend the night in his home, even if her purpose was innocent. "If your father agrees, I'll stay until you're fast asleep," she said. "And I have an idea about Thunder Horse, too." After Mathew had helped Samuel wash and change into his nightshirt, A somewhat awkward process with the boy's splinted arm, he carried his son to the small bedroom off the main living area. Willa followed, carrying a lamp. "What about Thunder Horse?" Samuel asked as Mathew tucked the blanket around him. Willa sat in the small chair beside the bed. "I'll tell you a secret, Samuel. When I was a little girl in Pennsylvania, my father taught me how to whittle. I've made many things over the years, including horses." Samuel's eyes widened. "Really? Could you make a new Thunder Horse?" "I believe I could," she said thoughtfully. "It wouldn't be exactly the same as your special horse, but it would be a brave steed all its own." "Would you?" Samuel asked, his voice small and hopeful. "Please?" Willa smiled. "I'll need some wood and a good knife." "I have both in the shed," Mathew said, surprised by her offer. "Are you sure? It's fine work and it's getting late." "I'm sure," Willa said, meeting his gaze. "I find whittling soothing, and I think Samuel needs his protector, don't you?" Mathew felt a surge of gratitude toward this stranger, who seemed to understand his son's needs so intuitively. "I'll fetch what you need." He returned shortly with a block of pine, what he'd been saving for fence repairs, and his best whittling knife. Willa examined both with an appraising eye, testing the sharpness of the blade against her thumb. "This will do nicely," she said. "Now, Samuel, you close your eyes and dream of what your new horse should look like, and by morning we'll see what we can do." Samuel yawned, his eyelids already heavy. "Will you sing to keep the monsters away?" Willa looked momentarily taken aback, but then nodded. "Of course." As Mathew turned to leave, Willa began to sing in a clear, sweet voice a lullaby about stars and dreams that he hadn't heard since his own childhood. He paused in the doorway, watching as his son's eyes drifted closed and Willa's fingers began to move deftly over the block of wood, the blade making the first tentative cuts. Something shifted in his chest at the sight, a loosening of a tightness he'd carried for so long he'd forgotten it was there. With a last glance at the peaceful scene, he quietly stepped out to tend to the evening chores, leaving the door slightly ajar so the gentle sound of Willa's singing could follow him into the gathering darkness. The night deepened as Mathew completed his routine checking the livestock, securing the barn, making one final circuit of the property before returning to the house. The lamp still burned in Samuel's room, and he approached quietly, not wanting to disturb his son if he'd fallen asleep. Willa sat in the same chair, but Samuel was indeed sleeping soundly, his splinted arm resting carefully atop the blanket. In her hands, the block of pine had already begun to take shape, the rough outline of a horse emerging from the skilled movements of her knife. She looked up as Mathew entered, putting a finger to her lips and rising carefully from the chair. They moved into the main room where she continued her work at the table by lamplight. "He fell asleep quickly," she said softly. "He's a brave little boy." Mathew poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot he'd left warming on the stove. "He is that. Gets it from his mother." He handed Willa a cup, which she accepted with a nod of thanks. "May I ask what happened to your wife?" she asked, her eyes on her work as her fingers guided the blade along the wood grain. "Influenza," Mathew answered, the word still difficult to say even after 2 years. "Winter of '77. It took a dozen folks in town before it was done." Willa nodded, understanding in her eyes. "I'm sorry." "It's not easy raising a child alone." "No, it isn't." Mathew watched her hands as they worked, strong and sure in their movements. "You're skilled with that knife." A small smile touched her lips. "My father was a cabinet maker. He believed girls should learn useful skills as well as boys. My mother was horrified, but he taught me anyway." She blew wood shavings from the emerging form. "And you? Samuel says you're a rancher." "I run cattle, mostly. About 200 head on 5,000 acres north and east of town. It's good land, better than most in these parts." "And is Samuel your only child?" Mathew nodded, a familiar ache in his chest. "Elizabeth and I had hoped for more, but it wasn't to be." They fell into a companionable silence, broken only by the scrape of the knife against wood and the occasional crackle from the stove. Mathew found himself studying Willa's face in the lamplight, the concentration in her eyes, the slight furrow between her brows as she worked on a particularly delicate area. "And your husband?" he asked after a while. "You mentioned you're a widow." Her hand stilled momentarily. "Yes. Thomas was a banker. The influenza took him too last winter." She resumed her work, but her expression had closed somewhat. "We had no children." Mathew sensed there was more to the story but didn't press. Everyone had the right to their private sorrows. "The school position," he said instead. "It doesn't pay much, I should warn you. The town's still growing." "I don't need much," she replied. "Just a purpose and a place to belong." Those simple words resonated with Mathew more deeply than he would have expected. Wasn't that what everyone was seeking out here in the territory? A purpose. "A place to belong. Seligman's a decent town," he said. "Good people, mostly. Not much in the way of culture compared to Chicago, I imagine." Willa's lips curved slightly. "I've had enough of city culture to last a lifetime, Mr. Hartridge. I came west for the openness, the possibility." "Mathew," he corrected her, "if you're going to spend the night carving a horse for my son, I think we can dispense with formalities." Her smile widened. "Mathew, then, and I'm Willa." As midnight approached, the form of the horse had emerged more clearly from the wood, a proud neck, a flowing mane, powerful legs poised as if in mid-gallop. Willa worked with remarkable speed and skill, her knife finding the shape within the wood as if it had been waiting to be released. Mathew found himself talking more than he usually did, telling her about the ranch, about his hopes for Samuel, about the changing nature of the territory as the railroad pushed ever westward. Willa listened attentively, asking questions that showed genuine interest, occasionally sharing her own observations of the East's transformation in the years following the war. When the clock on the mantel struck midnight, Mathew reluctantly rose. "I should let you work in peace," he said. "The spare room is through that door. It's not much, but the bed's clean." "Thank you," Willa said, looking up from her carving. "I won't be much longer with the rough shaping. The detailing can wait until morning." Mathew hesitated at his bedroom door. "Willa," he said, "thank you for this. It means more than I can say to Samuel and to me." She met his gaze steadily. "It's nothing, truly. I'm glad I can help." As Mathew lay in his bed later, listening to the soft sounds of Willa's knife against wood from the other room, he realized it had been the first evening since Elizabeth's death that he'd felt something approaching contentment. The thought both comforted and disturbed him, and he fell into an uneasy sleep filled with dreams of wooden horses galloping across endless plains. Morning arrived with the first tentative rays of sun filtering through the curtains. Mathew woke with a start, momentarily disoriented by the silence in the house. Usually, Samuel was up with the sun, his energy boundless despite the early hour. He dressed quickly and moved into the main room, where he found Willa asleep at the table, her head resting on her folded arms beside the wooden horse. The carving was nearly complete, a magnificent animal captured in mid-stride, its mane and tail flowing as if caught by the wind, every detail lovingly rendered. Mathew stood transfixed by the sight. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, far beyond what he had expected. It wasn't just a toy, it was a work of art, even without the final finishing touches. As if sensing his presence, Willa stirred, lifting her head and blinking in momentary confusion. When her eyes found Mathew, awareness returned and she straightened, pushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "I must have dozed off," she said, her voice husky with sleep. "You've been working all night," Mathew replied, moving to stoke the fire in the stove. "Coffee, please," she said, stretching her shoulders discreetly. Mathew set about preparing breakfast, acutely aware of Willa's presence at his table. It had been so long since he'd shared early morning moments with anyone but Samuel that the simple domesticity of it felt both foreign and oddly right. "He's going to love it," Mathew said, nodding toward the horse as he set a cup of coffee before her. Willa picked up the carving, examining it critically. "It still needs sanding and finishing, but I think it will do." She ran her fingers over the wooden mane. "I tried to make it similar to the broken one from what I could see of the pieces." Before Mathew could respond, Samuel's voice called from his bedroom, "Papa, is it morning?" "It is, son," Mathew called back. "Come on out for breakfast." There was a rustling, then the sound of small feet padding across the floor. Samuel appeared in the doorway, his hair tousled from sleep, his splinted arm held carefully against his chest. He blinked at the sight of Willa, then broke into a wide smile. "You stayed. Did you keep the monsters away?" Willa nodded solemnly. Not a single one dared to show its face. Samuel's gaze fell on the wooden horse and his eyes widened in wonder. "Is that for me?" "It is," Willa said, holding it out to him. "He's not quite finished yet, but I thought you might like to see him." Samuel approached reverently, taking the carving in his good hand. He turned it over, examining every detail with the serious concentration only a child can muster. "He looks like he's running really fast," he said in awe. "The fastest horse in the territory," Willa confirmed. "Just like Thunder Horse." Samuel looked up at her, his eyes shining. "Can I name him Thunder Horse too?" "Of course," Willa said. "He's your horse. You can name him whatever you like." "Thunder Horse the Second," Samuel declared grandly. "Thank you, Miss Willa, he's perfect." Mathew watched the exchange with a tightness in his throat. In that moment, Willa Easton stopped being a stranger who had happened to help his son. She became someone who had brought joy back into his home, however temporarily. After a breakfast of flapjacks and bacon, during which Samuel chattered excitedly about all the adventures his new horse would have, Willa excused herself to return to the boarding house. "I should change and prepare for my meeting with the mayor," she explained, gathering her shawl. "And I'll bring my sanding materials back this afternoon to finish Thunder Horse the Second, if that's acceptable." "More than acceptable," Mathew said. "Will you join us for supper again? Mrs. Cleary won't be back until tomorrow." Willa hesitated, then nodded. "I'd be glad to, thank you." As Mathew walked her to the door, Samuel called after her, "You'll come back for sure, won't you, Miss Willa? Promise?" "I promise," she said, her eyes meeting Mathew's briefly before she stepped out into the clear morning air. Mathew stood on the porch watching her walk toward town, her figure straight and purposeful against the backdrop of distant mountains. Samuel came to stand beside him, the wooden horse clutched in his hand. "I like Miss Willa, Papa," he said simply. "She's nice." Mathew rested his hand on his son's shoulder, his gaze still following Willa until she turned onto the main street and disappeared from view. "Yes," he agreed quietly. "She is." The days that followed took on a rhythm that was both new and comforting. Willa secured the teaching position with the town council and began preparing for the school term that would start in September. She became a regular visitor to the Hartridge home, often joining them for supper and staying to read stories to Samuel before bedtime. The wooden horse was finished to perfection, sanded smooth and polished with beeswax until it gleamed in the lamplight. Samuel treasured it even more than the original, carrying it everywhere and making up elaborate stories about its adventures. Mathew found himself looking forward to Willa's visits with an eagerness that both excited and alarmed him. It had been so long since he'd felt anything resembling attraction that he hardly recognized it at first. But there was no denying the quickening of his pulse when she arrived, or the lingering of his gaze when she was engaged in conversation with Samuel. Willa, for her part, seemed content with their growing friendship. She spoke more freely of her life in Chicago as the weeks passed, though Mathew sensed she still held parts of herself in reserve. He respected her privacy, understanding all too well the need to keep certain sorrows hidden away. It was nearly a month after Willa's arrival in Seligman when circumstances conspired to deepen their connection. A summer thunderstorm had swept across the territory, bringing much-needed rain but also flooding the creek that ran near town. Mathew had ridden out to check on a section of fence reported damaged, leaving Samuel in Mrs. Cleary's care for the afternoon. The storm intensified unexpectedly, turning the usually docile creek into a raging torrent that cut Mathew off from the direct route back to town. Forced to take a longer path around the floodwaters, he arrived home well after dark, soaked to the skin and chilled despite the summer warmth. To his surprise, he found Willa sitting at his kitchen table, a lamp burning low beside her as she grated papers. She looked up at his entrance, relief washing over her features. "Thank goodness," she said, rising quickly. "Mrs. Cleary was worried sick when you didn't return before dark. She had to go home to her ailing husband, so I offered to stay with Samuel." Mathew removed his dripping hat, water running in rivulets from his clothing onto the floor. The creek flooded, had to go 10 miles around. He shivered involuntarily, his teeth beginning to chatter. "Samuel, asleep," Willa said, her brow furrowing as she took in his condition. "You're freezing. You need to get out of those wet clothes before you catch your death." The practical concern in her voice warmed him almost as much as the fire she quickly built up in the stove. She turned her back discreetly as he stripped off his sodden coat and shirt, wrapping himself in the blanket she handed him without turning around. "I'll make coffee," she said, still facing away from him. "You should change completely. I won't look, I promise." Mathew couldn't help but smile at her proper concern, even as another violent shiver shook him. "I'll just go to my room," he managed, clutching the blanket around his shoulders as he moved toward the bedroom door. When he emerged in dry clothing, a steaming cup of coffee waited for him, along with a bowl of stew that Willa had kept warm on the back of the stove. "Mrs. Cleary left this," she explained, pushing the bowl toward him. "Eat while it's hot." Mathew sat at the table, gratefully wrapping his hands around the coffee cup before taking a long sip. The warmth spread through him, easing the chill that had settled into his bones during the long ride. "I'm obliged to you for staying with Samuel," he said, meeting Willa's concerned gaze. "You didn't have to do that." "Of course I did," she replied simply. "He was worried about you." Mathew started on the stew, suddenly ravenous. "Were you?" he asked before he could stop himself. Willa's cheeks colored slightly, but she held his gaze. "Yes," she admitted. "The storm was fierce, and the creek has flooded before. Sheriff Cooper mentioned it can be dangerous." The simple admission touched Mathew deeply. He'd grown so accustomed to facing life's challenges alone that the idea of someone worrying for his safety felt almost foreign. "It was touch and go in a couple of spots," he acknowledged, "but I know this land. I wouldn't take foolish risks." "Because of Samuel," Willa said with understanding. "Yes." Mathew finished the last of the stew, pushing the bowl aside. "He's already lost his mother. I don't intend for him to be an orphan." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the pattering of rain against the windows and the occasional rumble of distant thunder. The storm was moving away, but its presence lingered in the charged atmosphere of the small kitchen. "I should go," Willa said finally, gathering her papers. Now that you're safe home." Mathew glanced at the window where the rain still fell steadily. "It's a fair walk to the boarding house and it's still coming down hard. You're welcome to take the spare room again." Willa hesitated, clearly weighing propriety against practicality. "I wouldn't want to impose." "It's not an imposition," Mathew assured her, "and I'd rest easier knowing you weren't out in this weather." After a moment's more consideration, Willa nodded. "Thank you, that's very kind." As he showed her to the spare room, providing a nightshirt of Elizabeth's that had remained folded in a drawer for 2 years, Mathew was struck by how natural it felt to have Willa in his home. The empty spaces that had echoed with absence for so long seemed less hollow in her presence. He lay awake long into the night, listening to the rain and thinking of the woman sleeping under his roof. She had come into their lives by chance, a stranger who happened to be in the right place when Samuel needed help. Yet in the weeks since, she had become something more, a friend, a constant. A possibility he'd never thought to hope for again. The realization both exhilarated and terrified him. Elizabeth had been gone only 2 years, and he'd never expected to feel this stirring of interest in another woman. Was it disloyal to her memory? Or would she, who had loved life so fiercely, understand that hearts can heal and open again? With these questions still unanswered in his mind, Mathew finally drifted into sleep, his dreams filled with wooden horses and a pair of steady blue eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. Morning broke clear and bright, the storm having washed the world clean during the night. Mathew woke to the sound of laughter from the kitchen, Samuel's high, childish tones mingling with Willa's warm chuckle. He dressed quickly and followed the enticing aroma of coffee and something sweet baking. The scene that greeted him stopped him in the doorway. Willa stood at the stove, her hair loosely braided over one shoulder, wearing one of Elizabeth's old aprons over her dress from yesterday. Samuel sat at the table, Thunder Horse II prancing across the wooden surface as the boy narrated an elaborate adventure involving outlaws and a daring rescue. And then Thunder Horse jumped over the canyon. Samuel was saying, making the wooden toy leap from one side of the table to the other. The outlaws couldn't follow because their horses weren't as brave. "My goodness," Willa responded with appropriate awe, turning from the stove with a plate of flapjacks. "That was a tremendous jump." "Thunder Horse must be the bravest steed in all the territory." "He is," Samuel agreed seriously. "Papa says so." He spotted Mathew in the doorway and his face lit up. "Papa, Miss Willa is making flapjacks with honey, real honey." Mathew stepped into the kitchen, inhaling the sweet scent. "So I see." "Good morning." "Good morning," Willa replied, a slight flush coloring her cheeks as their eyes met. "I hope you don't mind. I found flour and a jar of honey in the pantry and Samuel was hungry." "I don't mind at all," Mathew assured her, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "Though I'm surprised Mrs. Cleary left anything resembling sweets in the house. She usually hides them from us." Willa's eyes sparkled with mischief. "The honey was behind the lard bucket on the top shelf. Samuel directed me to it with impressive accuracy." Mathew raised an eyebrow at his son, who attempted an innocent expression that fooled no one. "I see. Someone has been spying on Mrs. Cleary's hiding places." "Not spying, Papa," Samuel corrected earnestly. "Observing. Miss Willa says that's what scientists do. Does she now?" Mathew cast an amused glance at Willa, who was trying to suppress a smile. "And what else does Miss Willa say?" Samuel launched into an enthusiastic recounting of all the interesting things Willa had taught him over breakfast about bees making honey, about the stars in the sky being other suns far away, about the ancient Indians who had lived in the territory long before any of them were born. Mathew listened, watching Willa's animated face as she corrected or expanded on Samuel's retelling. She had a natural gift for explanation, breaking down complex ideas into terms a child could grasp without talking down to him. It was clear why the town council had been eager to hire her as their teacher. After breakfast, as Willa prepared to leave, Samuel tugged at her skirt. "Will you come for supper again tonight, Miss Willa, please? Papa makes really good beans on Saturday." Willa glanced at Mathew, a question in her eyes. He found himself nodding before he'd fully considered the implications of his son's growing attachment to her. "If your father doesn't mind, I'd be happy to," she said. "I don't mind," Mathew confirmed, perhaps too quickly. "Samuel's right, the beans are particularly good on Saturday." Willa laughed, the sound bright and unguarded. "Then how could I refuse? I'll bring an apple pie. Mrs. Holloway let me use her oven yesterday." After she had gone, Samuel looked up at Mathew with serious eyes. "I like it when Miss Willa is here," he said. "The house feels happier." Mathew ruffled his son's hair, his chest tight with emotions he couldn't quite name. "Yes," he agreed softly, "it does." The weeks of summer passed in a golden haze. Willa became a fixture in their lives, joining them for meals several times a week, accompanying them on Sunday outings to the creek, once Samuel's arm had healed, bringing books and ideas and laughter into the house that had known too much silence. Mathew found himself looking for excuses to be in town, timing his errands to coincide with Willa's preparations at the schoolhouse. He would offer to help move desks or hang maps, lingering afterward to walk her back to the boarding house in the lengthening evening shadows. During these walks, their conversations deepened. Mathew spoke of his childhood in Missouri, his journey west after the war, his dreams for the ranch. Willa shared stories of her teaching in Chicago, her love of literature, her fascination with the natural world. But always, there remained a certain reserve, a careful distance that neither seemed willing to bridge. Mathew told himself it was respect for propriety, for the watchful eyes of a small town where gossip traveled faster than telegrams. Yet in his heart, he knew it was his fear of opening himself to loss again, and perhaps hers of trusting whatever had driven her from Chicago. It was Mrs. Cleary who finally spoke the unspoken, in her characteristically blunt fashion. "Are you going to court that teacher properly?" she demanded one morning as she aggressively kneaded bread dough, "or just keep mooning after her like a lovesick calf?" Mathew nearly choked on his coffee. "I beg your pardon." Mrs. Cleary fixed him with a stern gaze, flour dusting her forearms. "You heard me, Mr. Hartridge. That woman has been coming to this house regular as Sunday for nearly 3 months. Samuel adores her, and you light up like a Christmas tree whenever she walks through the door." Mathew opened his mouth to deny it, then closed it again. There was no point in pretending with Mrs. Cleary, who had known him since he first came to Seligman and had stepped in to help with Samuel after Elizabeth's death. "It's complicated," he said instead. "Pshaw," Mrs. Cleary snorted, punching the dough with particular vigor. "Only because you're making it so. She's a fine woman, educated and kind, and she looks at you the same way you look at her when you think no one's watching." Mathew's heart gave a hopeful lurch. "Does she?" Mrs. Cleary rolled her eyes heavenward as if seeking divine patience. "Lord save me from blind men. Yes, she does. But she's a proper woman who won't make the first move, and if you wait much longer, someone else is going to notice what a catch she is. That new doctor's been sniffing around her already." The thought of Dr. Mercer, young, educated, and undeniably handsome, pursuing Willa sent a jolt of alarm through Mathew. She wouldn't what? Accept the attentions of a man who actually declares his intentions. Mrs. Cleary shook her head. "Women have needs too, Mr. Hartridge. Companionship, family, a place to belong." Willa's own words from that first night echoed in Mathew's mind, a purpose and a place to belong. Wasn't that what he wanted to offer her? What he'd been too afraid to articulate, even to himself? Elizabeth wouldn't want you to be alone forever, Mrs. Cleary said more gently, correctly interpreting his silence. She loved life too much to wish loneliness on anyone, especially you and that boy. Mathew stared into his coffee cup, the truth of her words settling into the places in his heart that had been closed for too long. "What if Willa doesn't feel the same?" he finally asked, voicing his deepest fear. Mrs. Cleary resumed her kneading, a knowing smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Only one way to find out, isn't there?" The opportunity came sooner than Mathew had expected. That very evening, Willa arrived for supper with news. The schoolhouse was finally ready, every desk in place, books unpacked, maps hung on freshly whitewashed walls. "School can open next Monday as planned," she announced, her eyes bright with excitement. "The town council is pleased." They celebrated with a special meal, a chicken Mrs. Cleary had roasted before leaving for the day, fresh bread, and the season's last peaches preserved in syrup. Samuel was allowed to stay up later than usual, listening wide-eyed as Willa described what school would be like, his initial apprehension giving way to enthusiasm as she outlined the interesting subjects they would explore. After Samuel had finally been tucked into bed, his wooden horse standing guard on the bedside table, Mathew and Willa sat on the porch in the comfortable silence of a late summer evening. Crickets chirped in the darkness, and the first stars were appearing in the deep blue sky overhead. "Samuel's going to do well in school," Mathew said, breaking the quiet. "He's bright, gets that from his mother." Willa smiled in the dim light. "He's very bright, and curious about everything, the best kind of student." Another silence fell, but this one held a different quality and expectancy, as if the night itself were holding its breath. "Willa," Mathew began, his heart hammering in his chest, "there's something I've been wanting to say." She turned toward him, her face partly in shadow. "Yes." Mathew took a deep breath. "These past months having you here in our lives, it's been good, better than good." "For me as well," Willa said softly. Encouraged, Mathew continued. "I haven't felt this way in a long time, not since Elizabeth. I never expected to feel it again." Willa's hands twisted in her lap. "Mathew, please," he interrupted gently. "Let me finish before my courage fails me." He reached for her hand in the darkness, finding it cool and steady in his own. "I care for you, Willa, more than I thought possible. And if there's any chance you might feel something similar, I'd like to court you properly. With your permission." The moment stretched between them, taut with possibility. Then Willa's fingers tightened around his and her voice came, barely above a whisper. "Yes." The simple word hung in the night air, luminous with promise. Mathew's heart soared, and he raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Willa's face was still partly in shadow, but he could see the curve of her smile. "There's something you should know," she said after a moment. "Something I haven't told you about why I left Chicago." Mathew waited, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. "My husband," Willa began, "was not a kind man. Our marriage was difficult. When he died, I felt relief more than grief, and then guilt for feeling relieved." Her voice trembled slightly. "I came west not just for a new start, but to escape the memories and the shame." Mathew absorbed this, understanding now the reserve he'd sometimes sensed in her. "There's no shame in seeking happiness, Willa. Some would say there is, in a widow who doesn't properly mourn her husband." "Not me," Mathew said firmly, "and not anyone whose opinion matters." She was silent for a long moment. "I was afraid to tell you, afraid you'd think less of me." "Never," Mathew assured her, squeezing her hand. "Your past is part of what made you who you are, the woman I've come to care for deeply." Willa's silhouette nodded in the darkness. "Thank you for understanding." Mathew felt as if a weight had lifted from both of them, his fear of moving forward, her fear of her past catching up to her. They sat in companionable silence as the stars multiplied overhead, their hands still joined between them, a connection that promised more to come. The courtship of Mathew Hartridge and Willa Easton became the talk of Seligman, though most of the gossip was good-natured. They made no secret of their attachment, attending church together, taking Sunday afternoon walks through town, sharing meals at the small hotel restaurant on special occasions. Samuel was delighted by the development, appointing himself their chaperone with solemn importance. He insisted that Thunder Horse II accompany them on their outings, explaining gravely to Willa that the wooden steed would protect them from any dangers that might arise. As autumn painted the landscape in golds and reds, the school thrived under Willa's guidance. Children who had previously shown little interest in learning began bringing home proudly completed assignments, eager to share their new knowledge. Parents who had been skeptical of the Eastern lady found themselves won over by her genuine concern for their children's progress and her respectful integration of local history and practical skills into her curriculum. Mathew found himself falling more deeply in love with each passing day. He loved watching Willa with Samuel, her patience and humor drawing out the best in his sometimes stubborn son. He loved the way her eyes lit up when discussing a book or a new teaching method. He loved her quiet strength and the grace with which she handled the occasional raised eyebrow from those who thought their courtship was progressing too quickly. When the first snow fell in late November, dusting Seligman with white, Mathew knew it was time. He rode into town on a crisp Saturday morning, leaving Samuel in Mrs. Cleary's care, and made his way to the town's sole jewelry shop. Mr. Abernathy, the elderly proprietor, greeted him with knowing eyes. "Been expecting you, Mr. Hartridge. Got something special set aside, if you'd care to see it." He produced a small velvet box from beneath the counter and opened it to reveal a ring of delicate craftsmanship, a modest diamond flanked by two small sapphires, set in polished silver. "The blue stones reminded me of the schoolmistress's eyes," Mr. Abernathy explained. "Came in last month from back east, been saving it." Mathew stared at the ring, its simple elegance perfect for Willa's understated tastes. "It's exactly right," he said, reaching for his wallet. "How much do I owe you?" The price was dear but fair, and Mathew paid it without hesitation. As he tucked the small box into his vest pocket, Mr. Abernathy offered his congratulations with a warm handshake. "Mrs. Hartridge was a fine woman," the jeweler said, his roomy eyes kind. "She'd approve, I think. Miss Easton's got the same good heart." Mathew nodded, touched by the old man's sentiment. "Thank you, Mr. Abernathy. I believe she would." The ring burned a hole in his pocket for a week as Mathew waited for the right moment. It came unexpectedly on a Sunday afternoon, as they walked along the creek that had nearly kept them apart during that summer storm. Samuel had run ahead, Thunder Horse galloping through the air in his hand, as he enacted some imaginary adventure. The day was cold but clear, the creek partially frozen at its edges, the bare branches of cottonwoods etched against the blue sky. Their breath formed clouds in the crisp air as they walked side by side, their gloved hands occasionally brushing. "I love this land in winter," Willa said, gazing at the stark beauty of the landscape. "It's honest somehow, no pretense." "Like you," Mathew said, stopping to face her. "That's one of the things I love most about you, Willa, your honesty." She smiled up at him, her cheeks pink from the cold. "Is it?" "Yes." Mathew took her hands in his. "There are many things I love about you, your kindness, your intelligence, The way you see the world and help others to see it too. The way you carved a wooden horse all night for a boy you just met because you understood what it meant to him. Willa's eyes widened as he reached into his pocket and withdrew the small box. I love the life we've begun to build these past months, Mathew continued, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. And I want to build more a lifetime if you'll have me. He opened the box, the ring catching the winter sunlight. Willa Easton, will you marry me? Tears sprang to her eyes, glittering like the diamond in the ring. Yes, she said, her voice breaking on the word. Yes, Mathew, I will. He slipped the ring onto her finger over her glove, promising a proper fitting later. Then he drew her close and kissed her, a gentle meeting of lips that held the promise of all the kisses to come. A whoop of excitement broke them apart as Samuel came running back, having witnessed the proposal from his vantage point upstream. Does this mean Miss Willa will live with us forever? He demanded, bouncing on his toes. Mathew laughed, keeping one arm around Willa's waist. If she'll have us, yes. Samuel's face split into a wide grin. Thunder Horse and I vote yes. Willa knelt to his level, her eyes still shining with tears of joy. I vote yes too, Samuel. Nothing would make me happier than to be part of your family. Samuel threw his arms around her neck, nearly knocking her over with the enthusiasm of his embrace. Over the boy's shoulder, Willa's eyes met Mathew's, and the love he saw reflected there filled every empty space in his heart. They were married on Christmas Eve in the small church in Seligman, with Samuel standing proudly as his father's best man, Thunder Horse II tucked securely in his pocket. The entire town turned out for the ceremony, the church decorated with pine boughs and red ribbons, lanterns glowing warmly in the early evening darkness. Willa wore a simple gown of ivory silk, her chestnut hair adorned with small white flowers. As she walked down the aisle toward Mathew, her face luminous with happiness, he felt a sense of rightness so profound it nearly overwhelmed him. This was meant to be this woman, this moment, this new beginning. The reception was held at the hotel dining room, with music provided by local musicians and tables laden with food contributed by the townspeople. Even Mrs. Cleary unbent enough to dance a lively reel, though she claimed afterward that it was only to keep an eye on Samuel, who was whirling around the dance floor with every willing partner. As midnight approached, Willa and Mathew slipped away to the ranch, where Mrs. Cleary had promised to bring Samuel after the celebrations wound down. For the first time, they would be alone as husband and wife in what was now truly their home. In the bedroom that had once seemed so empty, Mathew took Willa in his arms, marveling at the journey that had brought them to this moment. From a broken wooden horse to a mended heart, from strangers to family, it seemed both miraculous and inevitable. Happy? He asked softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Willa's smile was answer enough, but she spoke the words anyway. Happier than I ever thought possible. I love you, Mathew Hartridge. And I love you, Willa Hartridge, he replied, the new name feeling perfect on his tongue. Welcome home. Spring came early to Seligman in 1880, bringing with it the promise of new beginnings. The ranch flourished under Mathew and Willa's combined care, with her organizational skills complementing his practical knowledge. The school thrived as well, with Willa continuing her teaching despite the raised eyebrows of some who thought a married woman belonged solely in the home. Samuel grew like a weed, his mind as active as his body. Under Willa's guidance, he discovered a love of reading that matched his existing passion for outdoor adventures. Thunder Horse II remained his constant companion, though the wooden steed now spent more time on a shelf than in active play as Samuel's interests expanded. It was on a warm May evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, paint the sky in spectacular colors, that Willa shared her news. "I've been to see Dr. Mercer," she said, her fingers laced with Mathew's. "He confirms what I suspected. We're going to have a baby." Mathew turned to her, joy spreading through him like wildfire. "Truly," Willa nodded, her smile radiant. "In November, he thinks." Samuel, who had been playing nearby, looked up with sudden interest. "A baby like Timmy Johnson's little sister?" "Yes," Willa laughed. "Though hopefully less inclined to scream at all hours if we're lucky." Samuel's brow furrowed in serious consideration. "Will it be a boy or a girl? We won't know until it arrives," Mathew explained. "If it's a boy, can I teach him to ride?" Samuel asked. "When he's old enough," Willa promised. "And if it's a girl, too." Samuel nodded, apparently satisfied with this answer. He disappeared into the house, returning moments later with Thunder Horse II, which he solemnly presented to Willa. "The baby might need this," he said. "To keep away monsters." Willa's eyes filled with tears as she accepted the beloved toy. "Oh, Samuel, are you sure? This is your special horse." Samuel shrugged with the magnificent casualness of childhood. "I'm too big for monsters now, but babies need protection." Mathew watched the exchange with a full heart, amazed once again by his son's capacity for love. The wooden horse that had brought Willa into their lives would now welcome a new Hartridge into the world, a symbol of continuity, of family, of the unexpected ways that love could transform lives. As darkness fell over the ranch, the three of them sat together on the porch, making plans and dreaming dreams for the future that stretched before them, as vast and promising as the Arizona sky. In the years that followed, the Hartridge family grew and thrived. Willa gave birth to a healthy son they named James in November 1880, followed by a daughter, Catherine, 2 years later. The wooden horse watched over each child in turn, standing guard against imaginary monsters and becoming a treasured heirloom passed from one generation to the next. Samuel grew into a fine young man, combining his father's strength with Willa's intellect. He attended university in California, returning to Seligman with new ideas for expanding the ranch and developing the growing town. Mathew and Willa's love deepened with each passing year, weathering the inevitable storms of life: drought years, economic hardships, the illnesses and losses that touch every family with the same steady strength that had characterized their beginning. And on quiet evenings, when the children were grown with families of their own, they would sometimes take out the wooden horse that had started it all, marveling at how a broken toy and a skilled pair of hands had changed the course of so many lives. "Do you ever think about how different things might have been?" Willa would ask, running her fingers, now lined with age but still deft, over the smooth wooden mane. "If Samuel hadn't broken his toy that day, if I hadn't been in the store when they brought him in." And Mathew would take her hand, pressing a kiss to the wedding band that had never left her finger, and reply with the certainty of a love that had stood the test of time. "Some things are meant to be, my love. Some hearts are destined to find each other, no matter what path they take." The wooden horse, still proud and strong after decades of love and care, seemed to agree, standing as a testament to the unexpected ways that broken things could lead to wholeness, and how a simple act of kindness could build a legacy of love that would endure for generations to come.